Hello again, everyone. Lots to talk about on this week's Opening Bell with me, Alex Steedman, and Matt Christie. What a show we have got to get our teeth into, you lovely people. We hope you are well and you were royally entertained over the weekend with all of the action. We're going to dive into all of that. Beterbiev against Bivol. Are you up in arms? Are you furious? Or are you surprised that there is the clamour and the furore that seems to follow these close decisions? Wardley Clark, what a result, what a performance from Fabio Wardley. Eubank back, Ben in the ring. Opataya looking like one of the best cruiserweights on the planet. Ben Whittaker, what did he do? What happened? What did we see? We're going to talk about all of that. Sky Nicholson, boxing clever once again. All of that on this week's show, plus much, 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 much more. Matt Christie, how are you?
I'm tip-top, mate. Thank you for asking. How are you?
Yeah, good. Yeah, really good. I've been listening to these Johnny Wilkinson podcasts, as you know, the I Am podcasts. And he had a breathing expert on one. By the way, these are from 2023. I'm playing catch up on them, but really interesting podcasts. All about human potential. Maybe you could call it spirituality. But anyway, there's a lot of different bases covered in this. But he had a breathing expert on one of his pods. Apparently, forget the stat exactly, but apparently you get around about 40-45% more air into your lungs breathing through your nose than you do through your mouth, Matthew. So in the last week, I've been doing a lot of nose breathing, and I feel great for it. I think all athletes, that apparently the long distance Kenyans who do the marathon in 2 hours, they're all doing that. They copped onto it centuries ago. So it sounds like there's something in it. Breathe through your nose, feel better about life.
I generally do. I thought I did, but when I'm exercising, it is certainly, you revert to the mouth, don't you? Next time I'll try my nose, see what happens.
It's hard to do it running. You need to build up and learn. It's hard, but small steps, Matthew, small steps. And I suspect it's something that the boxers can do as well. Now, I'm delighted to say this podcast is sponsored by NES Medical Limited. NES Medical specializes in complete medical coverage for boxing events, including fight night, ringside medical care, ringside medicine training courses, and expert second opinions on all aspects of boxing-related medical matters. Boxers' safety is their priority. You can find them on Instagram, that's NAS Medical Limited, or at www.nesmedical.co.uk. And our sincere and great thanks to Neil and all the team at NAS Medical. Now, you might hear some drilling on this episode as well. We've got workmen working on drains in the background outside my gaff. So apologies for all of that, folks, if there is some drilling going in. But we're going to drill down into the meat and the bones of all the action we had over the weekend. Before we do that, Matthew, I do want to discuss the seeming ongoing brewing spat or whatever it is going on between Eddie Hearn, Frank Warren and Ben Shalom. It does remind me a little bit of school playground bullying. Now, it started elsewhere, but perhaps we saw it come close to a head at the weigh-in for Eubank against Jarameta when Ben Shalom, trying to guide looked like his man, Chris Eubank Jr., towards the front of the stage, walked in front of Frank Warren and took a position there. Now, Frank pushed him. Frank wasn't happy. There was words afterwards. Eddie Hearn's been saying some things as well. I must admit, I don't really like the way all of that is unfolding. It seems childish. There seems an element of bullying. I feel uncomfortable watching all of that unfold in the way and the manner that it's unfolding. What do you make of it?
I think the same as you. I think Eddie Hearn and Frank Warren, after being enemies that I think behind the scenes, now and again they would have had a moment where they would respect the other. I would say there was more moments than that behind the scenes where they may have said to themselves, actually, they've done well there, where there was kind of unspoken respect, even though they were enemies in the public eye. I think Ben Shalom has come along, and it's almost galvanised this relationship between Frank Warren and Eddie Hearn, in that he is the new kid on the block, and very often the new kid on the block, if they're not as vocal, not as wanting to be in the public eye like Ben Shalom doesn't appear to be, he would appear to be an easy target. Now, we don't know exactly what's gone on behind the scenes with certain deals that have supposedly fallen through, with certain contracts that supposedly haven't been signed. That would be a source of frustration. But from the outside looking in, speaking to various people, it does appear that Matchroom in particular were largely on the front foot with this whole battle with Boxer, and to a degree you could understand it. I think Matchroom were beaten to the punch with certain signatures when Ben Shalom took over the role as the head of essentially the television output on Sky Sports. Fighters like Ben Whittaker, fighters like Fraser Clark, for example, who we'll talk about in a completely different respect later on in the show, went over to Boxer as opposed to went to Matchroom. But it's not massively comfortable to see. You can see that Ben Shalom at times is not at ease, even when it's his own show and there's no other promoters around. When he's asked to speak after certain fights, he's not massively comfortable in those surroundings. I also think this kind of recent, and when I say recent, I mean probably in the last 10 to 15 years, fascination with a promoter having to be in the shot of every weigh-in probably hasn't helped matters. Now, Ben Shalom, I remember speaking to him when he first kind of broke onto the scene about that. Is that something? He was like, I wouldn't want to do that, but you're asked to do that now. But I would say from his sense of pride for him is that if they're doing it for their fights, he wants to do it for his fights. He wants to be seen on this stage, which is now regarded as the biggest in the world, the most influential. And Ben Shalom has got an ego. We've all got an ego. And he wants to be seen and say, well, I put this one together. Thank you. I'll do this. But there's little doubt whatsoever that he's winding those two up, and those two are seemingly taking great pleasure in chuckling at him and everything else. And yeah, it does appear to be an element of bullying, but we don't know exactly what's gone on behind the scenes. But I think what it speaks to is you have now got these two superpowers who were previously against each other. Now they're wrapping their arms around each other, and Ben Shalom is just a bit of a nuisance to them. I think they were quite happy when they were doing it between them, but now Ben Shalom is involved. They're not doing a very good job of highlighting that they don't like him very much. Sorry, of disguising that they don't like him very much. How Turkey El Sheikh will react to that, I don't know. How important Ben Shalom is to Turkey El Sheikh, I don't know. How important in the long term Frank Warren and Eddie Hearn will be to Turkey El Sheikh, I don't know. But he is, Turkey El Sheikh, he is very keen to get all the best fights, and therefore he's keen for everybody to work together. And I think the biggest nod to that was the apology that came from Chris Eubank Jr. and the apology that came from Frank Warren. That wasn't Frank Warren going, yeah, I was probably a little bit harsh to Chris in the past. I'm going to do the right thing here and I'm going to apologise. He was more or less strong-armed into that. Because Frank Warren doesn't do apologies, particularly after his threatened legal action. So, yeah, we'll see how it plays out. But I think what you have got there is Eddie Hearn and Frank Warren very much showcasing their power against someone who is still very, very new to the business, and something that we will talk about. I think Shalom has likely made mistakes. I think what happened to Whittaker at the weekend, what happened to Fraser Clark at the weekend, might also speak to him being put under a bit of pressure to move these fighters along quite quickly so he can compete. I think we've said it several times that the Sky stable has got lots of young fighters, lots of promise, but it's not quite where the Queensberry and the Matchroom stable is as yet. And perhaps Ben Shalom, along the way, feels like he needs to get those fighters to a certain level quicker than perhaps they needed to be.
And there's no doubt that one of the complaints from Eddie Hearn is the fact that he says that Ben Shalom is hindering getting fights made between some of the different promotional outfits, or he is not getting those fights signed. Now, whether you believe that or not, or whether you just think it's politicking from the king of boxing politicians, then that is entirely open to discussion. What is clear, though, Matt, is that Eddie Hearn is looking to manipulate moments or phases of potential weakness for Ben Shalom, or he's looking to exploit perhaps some areas in which Ben Shalom isn't as skilled as Eddie Hearn, or doesn't have the experience of Eddie Hearn, and Hearn is sharp enough to exploit those when he has the opportunity. And we've seen over the course of the weekend, and previously, let's not forget that when Fraser Clark, Fabio Wardley was first mooted, those purse bids, you remember that saga behind the scenes, the going to Cardiff, the coming back on the train, all of that stuff. You remember how that played out in the public eye as well. And I think Eddie Hearn is trying to grab those moments by the scruff of the neck and exploit them now. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I hope personally we don't see too much more, if not any more, of the visual stuff, the outward obvious stuff that we saw, the playground stuff that we saw last weekend. I hope that we don't see too much more of that. But there's no doubt, we've heard rumours about from various sources about how good or how not the job that Ben Shalom is doing with Sky, and how much money is spent and how wisely he spent that money. And there are those rumours, but that's besides the by. That's between them. How those relationships with other people pan out, particularly those other promoters, is going to be interesting to see. Although, as I say, I don't really want to see much more of what we saw at the weekend.
No, and I think we operate in a very different world now, don't we? I think we saw a particular video go viral where IFL were interviewing Ben Shalom rather innocently at a red carpet event recently, and Coogan, whether you could say it's to his credit, knowing what his audience wants, he pulls in Eddie Hearn and essentially asks the pair of them what their squabbles are about, with a camera in their face, and that is Eddie Hearn's domain. That is where he will thrive.
Do you think that was given the close links between IFL Coogan and Eddie Hearn, do you think there's an element of that being stage managed, pre-ordained?
No, I don't actually. I think Coogan is good at that. I think he will have spotted Eddie Hearn. What Coogan will know is that had it been the other way round, and he was speaking to Eddie Hearn and he spotted Ben Shalom probably would have just not gone over. He will know that Eddie Hearn will go over. You speak about the Fraser Clark, Fabio Wardley saga, where the purse bids were pulled at the last moment, and we spoke about that in detail on the podcast when that occurred. I mean, I took a little bit of stick for the way that we reported on that, but we knew that the Eddie Hearn knew those purse bids had been pulled long before he announced it on social media. We know that Eddie Hearn knew those purse bids had been pulled when he was tweeting saying, "I can't wait for these purse bids today." And he already knew that they were over. And then he announced that they've just been pulled at the last moment. They were certainly pulled late in the day. Whether Ben Shalom was correct in the way that he did that, probably not. I think he was a little bit naive. But ultimately, his reason for doing so was he felt that Fraser Clark needed more rounds and needed more experience in the professional landscape before he went in with Fabio Wardley. And although Fraser Clark acquitted himself very well in the first fight, one might look back now on the whole thing and say that Ben Shalom was right to be wanting to hold his fighter back for a few more fights.
Well, Turki Al-Sheikh might well be a shield for Shalom in the short term if Shalom has got something to offer, courtesy of Boxer and the fighters that he brings to the table. In the short term, he might provide something of a shield. And if you don't think there's some truth in that, all you have to look back to is the fact that Frank and Eddie are working together and seemingly getting on quite well, inverted commas, in the short term, in the mid-term. How long that carries on remains to be seen, as long as the money is pouring in. But if you wanted evidence that ultimately Turkey's calling the shots right now, is the fact there was an image and a video, a very short one, from the event on Saturday, and that was Turkey reaching back to get Frank's hand and Frank holding Turkey's hand as they made their way to the ring. If ever you wanted a symbolic image of all that's at the heart of this Saudi revolution, that, my friends, is it. Frank Warren holding Turkey's hand, going to the boxing, being led towards the ring. There lies in the image that suffuses all of these stories and strands together. We shall leave it there. Now, did you enjoy Buster Rhymes and Missy Elliott?
No, not massively. I mean, to be honest, I was in this.
Google, find me a rap artist.
I was in the Sky Studios watching all that unfold, and thankfully, I was next to. I was starting to feel the pace a little bit by that point. But Anthony Yard absolutely loved it, who was next to me. And I think it was his energy that kind of got me through that particular section of the event and then back excited again for the main event. But no, my own personal opinion on that is whoever it is, whether they are your favourite artist or not, it just feels like just this massive intrusion of what you're watching. I understand it to a degree when you have... Ben Shalom used to do it, didn't he? When he first started out with the Ultimate Boxer tournaments, he'd have kind of musical interludes. I don't think it really works. But I'm 47 years old. Maybe someone who's 19 might have loved it. Probably not with those three, to be honest. They wouldn't know who on earth they were watching. But maybe it will work in the long term. It's not for me. Perhaps if you want to do that, do it before the boxing or do it after the boxing. But when you do it in the middle of the boxing, and particularly when one considers how long boxing takes, it certainly takes the wind out of the sail somewhat. As I say, whether it's an artist you like, whether it's an artist you don't, it just doesn't quite work for me.
Yeah, I'm coming round to the idea that there's a place for it. I'm coming round to the idea that there might be a place for it. But as you say, perhaps depending on the number of fights, the kind of event you've got, and before or after, teeing off the night, maybe less fights, or at the end after the big one, and it becomes a kind of all-nighter. It becomes a festival. It becomes a big event. I get that. I think just before, and that delay before the fight, I don't think that quite works. But I think we might need to just modernise our ideas on that, and I think maybe there is a place for it.
Yeah, very possibly. I think what we should say as well is that one of the criticisms that has been aimed towards Riyadh season events in terms of boxing is we can't criticise the matchmaking. Largely the fights have delivered, not all of them, but largely they have, as they will when fights are well matched. Is the pacing of it. There were an awful lot of breaks during the early Riyadh season events in that, and when I say breaks, I mean long extended breaks between fights. Saturday seemed to move along at a really nice pace until we got to the gap between chief support and the main event, and I think that was an hour and a half. However you fill that, that's too long if you are watching a sport event and you want to watch some sport and you want to watch that particular sport that's being advertised.
And interestingly, Matt, I was looking at the sort of monitoring the crowd, not by design, but just observationally as the evening progressed. And we think of that as being a kind of British, Irish, European thing where people flood in maybe for the co-main event and the main event. But actually, that was exactly the case on Saturday night, wasn't it? Very few people in early on, even for Eubank, for example. Very few people in, and only belatedly did the crowd start to come in later on, just like over here.
Just like over here, just like in Las Vegas. You know, you've covered fights out in Las Vegas. I've been to a lot of fights out in Las Vegas where you're there at 2:00 in the afternoon when it all tends to kick off out in Las Vegas, and you're probably one of about 7 people that's not involved in the fights that's sitting watching them. And frequently, even if you had a world title fight in chief support to a Pacquiao or a Mayweather fight, you wouldn't get people starting to come in until halfway through that chief support. That's when it would really start to fill up. So it's not just a problem out in Saudi Arabia, it's a problem all over the world. And perhaps it's yet another argument to say that do we need 6 or 7 fights, 10 or 11 fights, or do we just need 3 or 4 really good ones when it's these stellar big events that the whole world is watching?
Maybe you're always going to get that with events, inverted commas, or event-driven fights or evenings, event-driven evenings. Maybe you're always going to get that. Mind you, guess where I was last Tuesday night?
Ibiza.
Almost. Almost. I was kind of at Ibiza in London. Again, apologies for the drilling, folks. I wish it was a bass line, but it's not. We've got some workmen sorting out the drains behind the house. So apologies for that if it's spoiling your enjoyment of the show. No, I went to a gig. Have you ever been to the Roundhouse in Chalk Farm? What a venue.
Yes, I have, many years ago. Yeah, several times. Great venue.
Great venue. Really cool venue. If you've not been to see music or anything there, folks, go. It's a fantastic venue. Really cool venue. But I went to see Sasha and John Digweed. They're old DJ pals, been going for decades and decades. Two of the, I suppose, original DJs from back in the 90s, Sasha and Digweed. And they did a gig at the Roundhouse last midweek, but it was an evening gig, so it wasn't late into the night. It was a 6 till 11 gig. Really good crowd. It was just fantastic. It was so cool. I loved it. Had a good boogie. But as someone messaged me on Twitter the other day and said, "Stop, oi, Alex, stop talking about the Patreon. Stop asking for money, and stop going to Ibiza. You're nearly 60, for goodness sake." Well, I'm a fair way off that yet. I'm not going to talk about money anymore. We've done that. There is a link if you want to sign up at the Patreon on each and every episode, folks, and we appreciate those that have, but I'm not mentioning that anymore. But I'll tell you one thing, I will still be dancing for as long as there's air in the lungs and there's energy in the bones. I will still be dancing. You can't be closing avenues in your life, Matthew, can you?
Absolutely not. If you enjoy it, mate, you keep going. I fully intend to be having my week away at Worthy Farm at Glastonbury for as long as I possibly can, that's for sure.
Absolutely. As Defected say, music is the answer, folks. Music is the answer. And there are times when boxing absolutely seems the answer to many things in the sporting world, doesn't it? With the kind of intoxicating action that it can create. And even when you don't get action-driven drama, Matt, what you sometimes get, and we got on Saturday night with Beterbiev against Bivol, you get a kind of clawing intensity. What's going to happen? How is this going to pan out? What is it that we're going to see next? There is a kind of intensity and a captivating nature to the sport, even if it's not knockout action-driven frenzy. And I think we had a lot of that sort of quiet, subtle boxing beauty and intensity at the weekend with Beterbiev and Bivol, despite the fact that we had no massive moments of high drama or knockdowns.
One could argue that that's all that was missing from it. But I think what we saw was 2 high-end technicians, not necessarily at the top of their game. I think we could say that Beterbiev is at the end of his peak, if he's still anywhere near it, but he's still such a good fighter, intelligent pressure, relentless. And then you had Bivol as well, who I can understand why a fair amount of people thought that he was hard done by. I thought in sections of the fight, he looked like the better fighter. He was the one who I thought, if one of them was going to get on top and pull away, there were a couple of moments in that fight I thought it would be Bivol. I thought early on, Bivol might actually win every round here. And there was a point after Beterbiev's middle rounds comeback where Beterbiev suddenly seemed to gas a little bit and just seemed to be a little bit out of ideas, which is something we haven't seen before. Full credit to him for pulling it around. I had it all level going into the championship rounds 11 and 12. And for me, Beterbiev won both of those. I gave him both of those, and I gave him a 115, 113 scoreline. I think the kind of furore afterwards is surprising. I mean, I know that you spoke about it in something that for Ring Magazine. I've written about it for Boxing Scene, and I think it is important to break it down. I think you have spoken in particular really effectively, really coherently about the maths of the situation. But if we kind of just try and explain it now, there were 8 of the 12 rounds where only, and this is going by CompuBox stats. So I'm not saying this is the holy grail CompuBox stats, but let's just use it for a point of context here. 8 of the 12 rounds, there was less than 4 punches between them. So if you're a judge or you're watching on the television, it's going to be very difficult for you to be collating those punches as you go along. So 8 of those rounds are exceptionally close. Let's, for argument's sake, say there are only 3 that could have gone either way. So there's just 3 rounds that could have gone either way. If you scored that fight to Bivol, 115, 113, and there were 3 rounds that you accept somebody else with a different viewpoint or sitting on a different side of the ring could have scored for Beterbiev because they were so close, and they did score them for Beterbiev, that 115, 113 for Bivol becomes 116, 112 for Beterbiev. Take it step by step if you like, because all of a sudden you think that, you're like, that seems incredible. But work it out. Okay, let's do the first round. Give it to Bivol, then that becomes a draw. Take the next round, then that Bivol is up 115, 113, and the third round, Bivol is therefore up 116, 112. So if you accept there were close rounds, but you thought Bivol won, you also have to accept that it could have gone the other way. I would genuinely have no argument with Bivol winning that fight by numerous rounds, because a lot of the rounds were close. I was scoring it, admittedly, in a studio where I was next to boxers. There was all sorts of things going on. Perhaps I wouldn't be concentrating on it. Most certainly wouldn't be concentrating on it like a judge was, but I had asterisks alongside so many of the rounds to say they were close and they could have gone a different way.
And interestingly, Matt, you were doing that in a Sky studio, listening to a Sky commentary that was not overboard, but was pro-Bivol, or was, let's not say pro-Bivol, I mean pro-scoring Bivol, who thought Bivol won the fight. I think tight. I think Matt Macklin might have had it a draw and Andy Clark had Bivol winning. But it's interesting that you had 115, 113 Beterbiev. That shows, real fierce independence, because, you're listening to a commentary that is leaning you towards the other direction. So that in itself is quite interesting. But if you listen to DAZN and you listen to BT, again, it sums up, I think, you take those different broadcasters. I think BT were heavy Beterbiev, and DAZN were just leaning towards Bivol, like the Sky commentary as well. So you've got 3, let's say, independent outlets, although, that is always discussable. But with different viewpoints, it kind of sums the fight up for me in almost many ways.
Well, yeah, and I've also heard that I think the DAZN commentary team were there, the Sky commentary team were there, but the TNT commentary team were not. Now, I've heard Andy Clark say something quite interesting. He felt that people at ringside, the majority were favouring Bivol. People watching on TV, the majority seem to have been favouring Beterbiev. I've also spoke to other people that were actually in Saudi Arabia, and two different people have told me that on one side of the ring, which is likely where the commentators were, they like Beterbiev. On the other side, Bivol, and on the other side, it was Beterbiev. All of this just tells you it was a really close fight. And I think when people are squabbling on social media about it, I mean, goodness knows how many different kind of commentators they've heard and how many different kind of opinions that they've heard. And you say I was kind of independent. I wasn't listening. This is no offence to Andy Clark whatsoever, but I wasn't listening word for word to what Andy Clark was saying. There was probably more discussion on the sofa as opposed to listening zeroing in on the commentary. But, you know, people will look at social media feeds while they're watching a fight. They will look at how other people are scoring it. And I'm not saying that they are therefore easily influenced, but you retain that information in your head. And I think we've all been there. I've most certainly been there when I've been ringside for a fight and I've maybe scored the first 4 rounds to fighter A. I then just have a quick chat to the person next to me and find out they've actually scored 3 of those 4 rounds to fighter B, and you start to think, oh my gosh, have I got this completely wrong? And quite naturally, you will start to doubt your own opinion. And also, something else that we have discussed in the past at length, when you're examining the performance of the judges, is that the judges literally write down their score and then hand it in. I know for a fact when I've scored fights in the past that I feel like they're really close, but I look at my scorecard and I can see I've actually got it after 7 rounds, 6-1 or 5-2. I think, hang on a minute, he doesn't deserve to be that far behind. And then the 8th round comes along, or the 7th round comes along, and you're kind of thinking, well, maybe I can give him a share of this one, or I'll give him the benefit of the doubt there because he shouldn't be that far behind. So there's all sorts of things going on when you're doing it from home. This isn't an effort to sway anybody's opinion. My opinion is far from definitive because of the nature in which I scored it. I didn't feel that at the end of it, even though I'd scored it for Beterbiev, that Beterbiev is the best fighter and it was a great win. In all honesty, I think what this speaks of is one of those very rare cases where a draw would actually have been the fairest result. And I know we don't like draws. I know you could argue they're inconclusive. But ultimately, I don't think either fighter, even though they were both supersonic in my eyes, they were both top level, wonderful to watch. I don't think either fighter did quite enough to win it, and I don't think either fighter deserved to lose.
Christie's draw prediction, which I smirked at, I laughed at last week because I said you've been just waiting to throw a wild dart. Well, you're almost absolutely bang on the money, and actually your logic behind it was absolutely spot on. I think the biggest thing to come out of this, and we want to describe the actual fight itself and talk about that because it was captivating, and we need to discuss that with a view to if they might do it again or if they fight again in another direction. But the one real, and this is a recurring theme in boxing, I think the main thing that's come out of this is the fact that a lot of people seem to, and this is, experienced people in the business or experienced fight watchers, and even sometimes fighters themselves. I responded to a tweet by Shakur Stevenson where he's quoting some scores with exclamation marks. And his thoughts echo and chime with what a lot of other people think. And that is, if you've got a competitive fight, people seem to think there can only be 1 point in it or it's got to be a draw. You can get a ridiculously competitive fight. And this is a good example. I think any result from 116 to 112 to a draw, either way, is entirely feasible for me. Any of those results, 116, 112, 115, 113, or a draw. Either way, Beterbiev or Bivol, entirely feasible. And you can go through round by round by round. I was 115, 113 on the night to Beterbiev. I watched it again last night, actually tweaked a few of the rounds. I again could have it much closer. I actually went 116, 112 Beterbiev on reflection, watching it a second round.
Wow.
And that's largely because the 10th round I gave to Bivol on the night, and when I watched it back, I'm thinking, I'm not sure. I think I've got my notes mixed up from the 9th and the 10th. So I couldn't quite see why I'd done that. But the 7th, I think, is quite a pivotal round, because that's one that on both occasions I gave to Beterbiev, mainly courtesy of the strong, heavy, bullying surge in the last minute. But the first 2 minutes of that round were largely controlled and diffused by Bivol. So that's a pivotal round, really. I thought the last minute was more effective and significant, but I know Andy Clark, who I respect a great deal, Andy Clark breaks rounds down almost into first minute, second minute and third minute, and almost scores them in installments, and whoever's got the most installments then will win that round. And I think it's a really interesting way of looking at a boxing, and that might be the way to do it, it might not. I think in a 7th round, then for me that doesn't quite work in that instance, because you might have a bigger 1 minute than the other 2 minutes. But Andy would probably explain that better, and he might not come up with the same sort of philosophy in that instance anyway. But the 7th round was quite significant. You could easily have given that. The first 4 rounds were more difficult to score. I went 2-2 both times, but I definitely can see 3-1. Like 2 of the 3 judges on the night, they gave those 3-1 to Bivol. So even the rounds that were probably a bit more debatable on the night, the judges gave to Bivol. So those aren't rounds that you can shout about, even although I think they're probably 4 of the more contentious rounds of the fight. So you can do it bit by bit. It was close, really competitive, and could have gone both ways for sure. Absolutely. What did we see, Matt, from both fighters?
I think you saw Beterbiev somewhat frustrated at times. There were moments where he was almost the Beterbiev of old. He could almost get Bivol just where he wanted him. I thought Bivol was exceptional at times and not allowing Beterbiev to get on top. Just something else on it, though, which is in relation to both of the things that we're talking about here, is the replays that we saw. Without question, Bivol had the little flashes, the little moments, the little combinations. Bivol's were cleaner and they were more impressive. And I think after 7 of the 12 rounds, and we didn't see replays after all of them, but out of the replays we did, 7 of them were focusing purely on the work of Dmitry Bivol. Now, that can lead some to conclude that Bivol would have won that round. But what you also have to consider is the point of view of the editors in the studio, and there will be a moment where Bivol has just landed 2 or 3 shots. They've landed flush. Right, get that moment for me. We need that as slow motion. And they're working exceptionally quickly. So then all of a sudden, all we're seeing is the replays of Bivol. We're not seeing any work from Beterbiev in that particular round. And quite naturally, the commentators will then spend a bit more time talking about the work of Dmitry Bivol as opposed to Beterbiev. Something that I did find interesting on the night was when we did get to see some replays of Beterbiev towards the end of the fight, when he was coming on strong and probably had his best period of the fight. There were punches that I thought, while I was watching it live, there were punches that I thought were not getting through and they were purely just hitting the gloves. It was only when I saw the replay that I realised the punches of Beterbiev were actually getting through. Then you start to think about the CompuBox stats, because they're not doing them looking at replays, they're doing them as live. Now, Beterbiev threw about 1.5 times more punches than Bivol. It might be more than that, it might have been close to double the amount. But Bivol, when you add all of the punches up that they thought had landed, Bivol outlanded Beterbiev by 5 shots. And people are now saying that that's evidence that Bivol won the fight. It's such a tiny amount, and you can't feasibly believe that the people that are in charge of the CompuBox stats didn't miss a punch here or there. But I suppose the point is that Beterbiev might have been more effective than we realised. Bivol, however, if either of them could say that they had really strong moments where they're in control, it was Bivol who looked like he was in more control in those moments because he was more fluent, he was more accurate, and the punches were better. Just to kind of put it as rudimentary as possible, they looked like better punches because they were. But Beterbiev kind of motoring forward the way that he did, doing his best to cut off the ring, which he's a master at. Yet Bivol is a master of controlling the pace. I thought they were both doing that. And even though I felt that every second of that fight was so absorbing and so engrossing, in a way they were cancelling each other out. So as you're watching it, and you score a round for Beterbiev, then it's a round for Bivol, then it's a round for Beterbiev, then it's a round for Bivol. That is the mark of two brilliant fighters. Neither of them allowed the other to really gain a significant foothold in that fight.
I wonder if there needs to be more use of a 10-10 round. Personally, we've probably got, and I understand why it happened. Back in the 70s and 80s, those half point win scorecards and all of that. I do understand that, but you've talked about maybe grading rounds in the past, and I think if you graded rounds, if there was more judicious use of points, and it wasn't just simply 10-9 or knockdown 10-8, etc. If there was the opportunity to, then I think, in my mind, Beterbiev would have won this fight, because the bigger rounds I thought were Beterbiev rounds, 5 and 6 in particular, and then 11 and 12. You could throw in 10, and you could throw in the last minute of round 7. And if ever, despite Bivol's mastery and culture and technique and all of that, I think the really heavy moments, the bullying parts of that fight, the heavier shots. Look at Bivol's the side of left face, the left eye of Bivol. Those moments, end of the 7th, previously in the 5th and the 6th, definitely the 11th and 12th. Those were all big moments, and you could have, if you were grading a round, you could have given those as bigger rounds than, say, some of the clever boxing rounds that Bivol had previously. But I wonder, is there a case to say that, and I do it, I try and always give a 10-9 if I possibly can, and I'd say 95% of the time I probably do that, but is there a case to be said that if you can't split them, then it should be a 10-10?
Yeah,
more
I think
10-10s.
I think I said this before. Well, I know I've said it before about the 10-10 round. We know that Robert Smith of the British Boxing Board of Control will actively encourage a round to be scored one way or the other as opposed to level. Robert's not the only one. In terms of commissioners all over the world, people prefer there to be a winner of a round. But very often, I think if you've got to 2 minutes and 40 seconds and you don't know who's won this round, and then you're essentially just scoring it because someone just landed the last punch and you just give it to them because you've got to give it to someone, I think it's quite difficult. And I think fights like Josh Taylor, Jack Catterall that caused the absolute uproar, I think if there were more level rounds scored there, then I think Catterall would have comfortably won that fight. And I think you could say that. I think really a tweak to the scoring system on this occasion may not have made any difference at all. It's not like there was 2 or 3 big rounds for one of them and the other one kind of hacked away at it. It was nip and tuck all the way. But I must admit, apart from those last 2 rounds, 11 and 12, the only fighter that I thought was going to pull away at any point was Bivol. There were just moments where I thought he's worked him out. And Beterbiev is getting frustrated. And credit to Beterbiev for then readdressing the balance. At
his age, Matt, 39, and only 6 months after that knee surgery as well, or coming back from the knee injury. That is remarkable. Because as you say, I mean, what I would say, just contrary to that suggestion, it did look through 5, 6 and then into 7 as though Beterbiev was going to maybe start to steamroll Bivol. He was starting to, and the only tell that Bivol was hurt was the fact that he was just moving and not punching. And through the 5th and 6th rounds, a lot of movement on the back foot, but no punching. And that was the only tell, really, in an otherwise outstanding, excellent performance, boxing-wise, from Bivol. But it looked going into the 7th as though he might be in really big trouble. And I think, as you say, Beterbiev, he blew a gasket, didn't he? The fact that then he rallied in the 7th, great credit to him. But then the fact after that big bullying last minute of the 7th, that then the gas tank ran empty and it was Bivol who reasserted control. And through the 8th and 9th, it was then Bivol who looked like he was going to run away. That's what you get in these high-class fights, isn't it? That's what Usyk has done against Joshua in the rematch, against Fury in the second half of his fight as well. That's what these elite fighters can do. They can find another gear. They can find a plan B, a plan C. And we saw that unfold again and again and again. It was just remarkable, remarkable stuff. Now, the fact that Beterbiev, after rounds 8 and 9, was able to go again after his injury at his age in that kind of fight where he'd been posed lots of problems, great power to him, great power to them both.
Great power to them both. Great power to Bivol for getting through that period in rounds 5 and 6. He is the only fighter that Beterbiev has faced that has managed to not get stopped when it appears that Beterbiev is starting to turn the screw. Full credit to Bivol's intelligence there, his fighting spirit. And, you know, there was this notion beforehand that Beterbiev just keeps on going. He's relentless. He doesn't tire. Doesn't matter if he's lost 4 of the first 5, he's going to catch up and he's going to get you. But he'd never been in with anybody as intelligent as Bivol. So even though he may not have been exerting anything more physically than he normally does, mentally, psychologically, he will have been thinking a lot more than he usually does. Everything that kind of comes natural to Beterbiev, well, not everything, but certain things that just come natural, the certain pattern of his fights, not everything was falling into place for him. So he was having to rethink and readjust himself. So for both of them, it was the kind of fight that they'd never experienced before. You mentioned earlier about, and I've seen a lot of people say, well, look at the state of Bivol's face. I think that's also a bit of a falsehood. Just because Bivol's face was more marked up than Beterbiev's doesn't necessarily mean that Beterbiev won the fight. Beterbiev, for example, has more power than Bivol. Therefore, Beterbiev might just have to land 2 shots to make the kind of damage that Bivol would have to land 10. And also consider Bivol's defences. I said earlier, didn't I, that I was surprised that so many of the punches were getting through when I saw them in slow motion. But there was still a lot that were not. There was still a lot that were hitting gloves while his hands are up. And it's his own hands that are banging into his face. So I think that's another important one to, just for the sake of balance here, that we're not just crying out that Beterbiev won this fight. But no, it was really high-end stuff. Probably came away at the end of it thinking if there is a rematch, I'd probably favour Bivol this time. But whether there will be a rematch or not, who knows? It's all well and good for Turki Al-Sheikh to be walking away from the ring because in saying, well, that wasn't fair, I'm going to organise a rematch. He's got to persuade the fighters to do it. And I think he'll have more of a job persuading Beterbiev than he will Bivol.
Class from Bivol afterwards, no shout out. He could have. Eddie Hearn made a lot of noise, understandably, but he is more. He's a terrific operator, Eddie, isn't he? He's a terrific operator, but he is more and more doing things for effect or what he thinks needs to be done to get a desired result. We saw it when he was kind of prodding and probing Beterbiev at the presser. And in fairness, he got the kind of result he wanted. He was saying, these are interesting characters. And for me, with stuff like that, you've always got to look yourself in the mirror. And I could never do something just because I think it might get the right kind of desired reaction. But Eddie's been doing that, and he's getting those kind of reactions, and he got it from Beterbiev at the presser, and it created, I suppose, we got more sound bites from Beterbiev than ever before. So desired effect and job done, really. So maybe, he says 116, 112, that judge should never work again. We've already discussed it at length. I think that's just naive, shows a lack of understanding of mathematics and boxing scoring, and just the pattern of fights, full stop. But thus ever it was, and I think thus ever it will be. But you're not convinced Beterbiev would take up a rematch?
Well, I mean, yeah, money talks, of course it does. I think he's got to ask himself some questions about what he wants to get out of this sport now, in terms of, does he want to get out of this sport? Does he want to fight on? Does he want to go up to cruiserweight? Does he want to do something insane like go up to heavyweight and just try and make a bit of history? Does he want to go and try his luck with his old amateur rival like Alexander Usyk? I mean, what a chess match that would be. I don't know. Do I want to see the Bivol rematch? To a degree, but I almost feel like we would see a very similar fight again. I feel like we've been treated to that. But if he's not going to go up to cruiserweight, what does he do if he doesn't face Bivol? David Benavidez is officially the leading contender according to the WBC rankings. Benavidez likely to fight David Morrell in January. And then I'd much rather see the winner of that take on Beterbiev, to be honest. I almost feel like the Beterbiev-Bivol box has been ticked, in that you can't split them. They're both bloody good. You just can't split them. But I understand why an awful lot of people will be interested in that. I understand why Turki Al-Sheikh is saying he wants to see it again. But for me, it was just one of those fights. I feel like we got everything that we were going to get. I don't necessarily think it would be any more definitive in a rematch unless one of the two had started to deteriorate quite substantially.
It was a terrific, compelling fight. Maybe not the kind of fight that, having you gone and told those casual sports fans of yours, those occasional boxing fans of yours, that if they're going to watch one fight, then this is the fight that's going to sell the sport. It reinforced the sport and why we love it, for those that are, affectionate for boxing's nuances and all that it brings to the table, not just the fireworks and the drama and the knockouts, which of course we got in Wardley against Clark in their rematch. But all of that other stuff, it probably didn't sell it in the way that you were hoping it was going to do, Matt.
Probably not, no. But without wanting to sound snobbish, probably for want of a better word, you would need a fair bit of grounding in boxing to get the most out of that fight. You'd need some understanding, as you say, in the nuances of the sport, the nuances of the styles, of the different moves, of the little split-second adjustments. You'd need some understanding to really appreciate that. So if that was your first taster of boxing, I don't think for 1 second you'd have been bored, but you might have said, yeah, it was all right. It wasn't thrill a second. But I mean, for me, it's one of the fights that I've enjoyed the most in recent years, purely for the high level of skill on display. And even though there wasn't those jaw-dropping moments, those breathtaking moments, it was just poised from the very first bell to the last. You didn't know which way it was going to go. There wasn't any moment where there was a break really in the action. I mean, how many times did the referee have to split them up? Once or twice? True. It was just constant. It was just this constant psychological battle between the pair of them, and anything like that in boxing, I could watch all day long.
And let's reiterate: if you thought Bivol won, I'm not arguing with it, not one bit. Can easily see that by the score lines that we mentioned earlier on. I did think the sort of production or directorial decisions on the replays was slightly odd. As you said, it was very Bivol heavy, wasn't it? The coverage in terms of the highlights and the replays. And that's not just because that's all that was existing in those rounds. I thought that was interesting in terms of decision making, but Matt already touching on that. So much to talk about on the undercard, and because there is so much and so many talking points, what we're going to do is we're going to do a Patreon bonus pod later on this week, and we will cover all of the undercard action, plus we'll preview this weekend's action as well. Sam Gilly, Louis Green and Adam Azine is in action as well. Dan Aziz looking to win back his British light heavyweight title. So all of that we're going to cover in a special bonus pod for Patreons. And if you want to sign up for Patreon, there will be a facility to do that, by the way, on Apple soon. That's happening in the next few days or in the next week. You will just be able to sign up for the pod to subscribe via Apple as well, and make things easier if you're using that particular platform. So all of that will happen on a bonus pod later on this week. Next, though, it's time for This Week in History. And this week, we take you back to the 15th of October 2005. We're going to Germany. We're going to deal with two European light heavyweights in Dusseldorf, of course, where once upon a time Tyson Fury went to have a big boxing night. And on this night, it's two light heavyweights. It's Tomasz Adamek, who would end up, of course, at heavyweight, and Tomasz Ulrich. Adamek unbeaten in 29 with 20 knockouts. He was the WBC champion, defending his belt for the first time. And Tomasz Ulrich, a Berliner who'd only lost once, been a European champion not once but twice, and he was moving up in class to try and dethrone Adamek. And the reason I've chosen this particular fight, or one of the reasons I've chosen this fight, is that you can see throughout this fight, in some of the techniques and the movements, you can see Tomasz Adamek building moments towards the knockout. And he tries it a few times. The kind of moves that lead to the knockout, he tries them a few times from the third round onwards. And that's going to link to our bonus pod when we're talking about Fabio Wardley against Fraser Clark. Because although on the night, my feeling was that they're heavyweights and one punch or two punches can change the nature of a fight, and that can happen to any heavyweight on any given night. That was my sort of feeling about Wardley against Clark. But when I went back and watched it and watched some of the slow motions, I initially had thought, what did we learn? Did we really get anything out of that to know how much better Wardley or Clark were, or if they'd learned something from the first fight? And initially I thought no. And then when I watched it back a few times, there's little things that Wardley's trying, even in that short space of time, that lead to the knockout. And we're going to dissect that in the bonus pod later on this week. And there's a bit of that in Adamek against Ulrich, two Europeans, Matt, fighting for a light heavyweight world title.
Yeah, I was surprised when you pulled this one out of the hat, to be honest. Adamek against Ulrich. Nothing against either of those two particular fighters. But yeah, I just compared to what we did recently, like the Chris Eubank Nigel Benn rematch. But it's a really good fight. It's a really good scrap. Tomasz Adamek from Poland, 29-0 going into this fight. In his previous fight, he had won the vacant WBC title, which had been vacated at the time by Antonio Tarver. After Antonio Tarver had beaten Roy Jones, then Glenn Johnson went on to beat Roy Jones. There was one fight to make in the light heavyweight division at that particular point in time, and full credit to both Tarver and Johnson. Tarver ended up giving up his WBC title. He would rather face Glenn Johnson than Paul Briggs or Tomasz Adamek. Adamek wins the vacant title, and he enters into a bit of an agreement with Don King. Don King was not the official promoter for this first defence against Tomasz Ulrich, but Don King was doing an awful lot behind the scenes to get it over the line. Adamek paid handsomely, and I think that is the only reason why Adamek ventured into Germany to put his title on the line, because of the amount of money that he received. Thomas Ulrich was a bit of a hero at the time in Germany. He was on the left-hand side of the posters. Ulrich versus Adamek, even though it was Adamek was the one that was bringing the belt. 28-1 as a pro. He'd had some good victories as a professional. 1996, he'd won the Olympic bronze medal. He'd ended the career of Graciano Rocchiagani. And he was a quality boxer. I think if you've never seen Thomas Ulrich fight, and I tell you that he was a top 10 perennial contender at this time when fighters in that part of the world were excelling, European level, probably the best. Oh, sorry, if you take out the elite world fighters there, I think you would probably have a good idea of how he fights, and that idea would be quite accurate. It was a conventional, effective style, but he could bang. And he really went for this. I mean, there's moments, I think, in round 2, even though Ulrich suffers a cut, where the right hand from Ulrich is landing, and you look at Adamek and you wonder if he's going to keep on taking it. Don't forget that we didn't know what Adamek was going to go on to become at this point in time. This is in this is in the infancy of Adamek's incredible adventure in world boxing. And you look at Adamek, I mean, if you look at his photograph on BoxRec, it's one of my favourite profile pics of all the boxers. One of the most unassuming looking boxers on that website is Tomasz Adamek. You look at his physique in this fight, he looks slight, doesn't particularly have broad shoulders, and if you were to say at that particular point in time that this guy is going to go up, he's going to be dominant at light heavyweight, he's going to go and win belts at cruiserweight, and not only that, he's going to be a leading heavyweight contender for the best part of 6 or 7 years, you'd be like, there's absolutely no way. He doesn't look like he'd be able to hold a great deal more mass and still operate at such a high level as a boxer. That's what he went on to do. And on this night, there were certainly flashes of the quality operator that he was.
Great pace. Yeah, you can see his clavicles, can't you? You see his shoulder bones, and it seems so unlikely that this guy will build up into a cruiserweight, never mind to fight at heavy. I mean, he'd started at heavyweight, sort of 215, David Hay sort of weight, but he would end up sort of 225, 226 towards the tail end. And that was largely because of that defeat against Vitali in Wroclaw. I was there that night, ringside, calling that fight, and he just got beat up, a bit like Vitali had done to Samuel Peter, a bit like Vitali had done to Derek Chisora as well. He did that. He just heavy pounded Adamek into submission on that particular night. That would be in 2011. So we're quite 6 years later via cruiserweight as well. But on this night, Matt, really fast pace, battle of the jabs. Ulrich probably goes off too fast, too quickly, too soon, blows a bit of a gasket. And although he's competing, certainly through the first 3 or 4 rounds, Adamek starts to just ramp it up and take over a little bit in the 5th. And there's some great shots in between the 5th and 6th rounds. Ulrich gulping in air. I mean, he looks close to being distressed, Matt, doesn't he? But great credit to him. He comes out firing and fighting in that 6th round until finally Adamek walks him on to the kind of looping round the side right hand. And it had been in the post. He'd been trying it from round 3 onwards. Jab, slide to the left, and then looping almost like a hook of a right hand. And he'd missed, or he'd connected with gloves, or not quite connected a few times. And then suddenly, with his backs against the ropes, having been throwing a jab slide right hand, this time with his back against the ropes, he does a left hook, slides off the ropes, and then loops over the right hand. And the punch he's been looking for all night, finally, boom, there it goes.
It's a beautiful shot. I'm not convinced I saw this at the time, to be honest with you. Yes, it's a cracking shot. As you say, beautifully crafted. The orchestration of which was in the post. And I think if this was a computer game and you had their energy levels, you would see I noted it from about round 4 going into round 5, although Ulrich was still very much in it. he must have been thinking himself, I've gone a bit too early here. And I think because it was a world title fight, because he was the crowd favourite, his whole life had probably been building up to this moment. He just went a little bit too quickly out of those gates. But don't let that take anything away from the finishing shot of Adamek. But I think we should consider it when perhaps Ulrich would have been a little bit wiser to it if he hadn't been so both physically and mentally exhausted at that particular time. But at the same time, don't take anything away from Tomasz Adamek either. It was a tremendous shot to finish the fight.
And what a good refereeing performance from Ian John Lewis. You hardly noticed him. Maybe before he became I Am the Referee. Maybe. But you almost don't notice him, don't you, on this night?
This is when Ian John Lewis was recognised as the best referee in Britain, elevated to work in world title fights, which is kind of the highest honour for a referee. And he was a good ref. I'm not sure if he lost his way for whatever reason. But at this particular time, I suppose there was no doubts in his mind. He was just full of confidence, and I thought it was an excellent refereeing performance. This fight as well brought to mind the amount of times that I was out in Germany watching fights. It's a very different experience when you're out there. Yeah. I'm not saying it's a bad experience, it's just different. And the crowds can be silent, can't they, for large periods, and then all of a sudden you get a sense of the atmosphere. It's almost this foreboding atmosphere, like they're all there waiting for something to happen, and then they explode. And I remember Shannon Briggs, for example, and bringing in the Ian John Lewis, and that was almost a little bit where Ian John Lewis suddenly started to get a lot of criticism as a referee, wasn't it, when he allowed Shannon Briggs to go round after round after round with Vitaly Klitschko in a world heavyweight title fight. But yeah, you can't fault Ian John Lewis, and I think it perhaps shows you, doesn't it, how difficult the job of a referee can be, and how easy it is for them to be criticised, and then for that criticism to ring in their ears a little bit too much.
On this undercard, by the way, Jürgen Bremer had a 6th round stoppage win to move to 25-0. He'd been a European light heavyweight champion. He would become a world champion. Of course, he'd fight 2 Welshmen, wouldn't he? Enzo Macronelli in 2014. I remember that fight. I think it must have been on Box Nation at that fight. I think we covered it on Box Nation. That was the night Enzo had that horrible eye injury that I couldn't see out of it. It had to be pulled out. And then a couple of years later, Bremer would finally meet. He had on off against Nathan Cleverly. Finally, they fought in 2014, and Cleverly would win that fight. Jürgen Bremer, one of a sort of clutch of Germans through the 90s and the turn of the millennium and early 2000s, Matt. There was a kind of production line, wasn't there? Whether it was the Serlins or whether it was the boxing base out of Hamburg. There were a couple of fighting cities, Hamburg definitely being one of them for the Germans. And there's a whole, I mean, you could list a whole, Henry Masker, whoever, you could list a whole raft of Sven Otka, of German fighters. We don't have too many that slip off the tongue. We've had Tyrone Zeuger perhaps in recent years. There's not been too many. What's happened to German boxing? I'm
not sure, but at this particular time, even though I think certain boxing communities in different countries, in more established countries, or supposedly more established, used to look down their nose a little bit at boxing taking place in Germany. I think over in America, I think certain championships, certain weight classes were largely ignored out in America as a consequence of so much of it taking place in Germany. But when you do go over there and you witness it, it was of an exceptionally high standard. I think the matchmaking was generally pretty good as well on the bills. But yeah, I'm not sure what's happened to it. I'm not sure, but there was a period where in that part of the world they were, I think probably up to about from about 154 up to 175. There was a raft of top class and world class German fighters.
So where I started my boxing commentary career, really, out in Germany, commentating on Felix Sturm fights originally. over there in Germany, then Klitschko fights in Germany. It's kind of how I got my break on some of those gigs. And as you say, unique experience out there. And some of those Klitschko fights, that's the first sort of taste of how sort of VIP boxing experiences could be as well if you're a punter. They used to do those fantastically well over in Germany. If you wanted to go and watch it in a slightly different way, the Klitschkos and those VIP experiences were really interesting to at least get a little taster off when I was over there commentating. And Juan Carlos Gomez, the Cuban who was based out there, he was on this bill as well. He had a no contest, what became a no contest, against Oliver McCall. It was their first fight. They'd fight again a year or so later. That was turned to a no contest because Gomez failed a drugs test. He'd been a cruiserweight champion, hadn't he? I think he defended that WBC belt 10 times or something like that. He was on that particular bill as well. So that's from 2005. Really fast-paced, really heavy jab fight that was won by Adamek. And amazing to think, Matt, that he'd go up to cruiserweight, win a world title, and then he'd have success at heavyweight against some former names like Galotto, but he'd also be a sort of up-and-coming Chris Arreola in those days. Unbelievable to think of him as a heavyweight when you see him on this night.
But he kind of proved himself in and around. I mean, he never looked like he was going to beat Vitaly Klitschko, but when that fight was made, that was the natural fight to make. I think everybody was kind of could see the sense in that. Adamek had earned his spot as a top 5 heavyweight, and even though he lost to Klitschko, he still came back and surprised a few people after that. He was at no stage of his career, possibly late on, but at no stage of his career was he easy to beat. And even when he was a heavyweight, he didn't look out of place there when you look at his performances. And yeah, you go back to this night and have a word in someone's ear and say, this guy's going to go up and he's going to be the leading challenger for Vitaly Klitschko in a few years. They'd be like, get off my flipping shoulder, you nutcase.
I'm getting off your shoulder. I'm getting off. Sorry about that. Thanks to Neil and his team at NAS Medical Limited, who've sponsored this podcast. NAS Medical specialise in complete medical coverage for boxing events. That includes fight night, ringside medical care, ringside medicine training courses, and expert second opinions on all aspects of boxing-related medical matters. Boxer safety is their priority. And you can find them on Instagram at NAS Medical Limited or nasmedical.co.uk. And once again, thanks to them for sponsoring the pod. The bonus in the next few days will be the Saudi undercard plus this weekend's action. There's a link to the Patreon if you want to get a hold of that in a few days' time. If not, we'll speak to you again next week. Go well, people.